When most people think of World War II, they imagine grainy footage, history books, or Hollywood recreations. But for one Marine, Eugene Sledge, the war was deeply personal, and so was the legacy he left behind. You might know him as the author of With the Old Breed, or from HBO's The Pacific. But today we're stepping beyond the pages and the screen, into his son's home. Henry Sledge, Eugene's son, has carefully preserved the souvenirs, mementos, and relics his father brought home from the Pacific Theater. Each item tells a story, not just about the battles of Peleliu and Okinawa, but about the man who carried them, and how the war shaped the rest of his life. In this video, we'll see these powerful artifacts up close, we'll hear the stories behind them, and we'll discover how a son remembers his father, not just as a Marine, but as a man trying to make sense of a brutal war. This is the history you won't find in a textbook. This is Eugene Sledge's legacy, preserved through the eyes of his family. Let's take a look. Sledge's experiences in the Pacific weren't just etched into his memory, they found their way into the objects he carried home. Like so many young Marines, he collected small souvenirs from the battlefield.
This is a Japanese artillery officer's cap that my dad picked up on Peleliu. I was really fascinated by this as a kid because of the little earplugs. But my dad picked this up somewhere in the ridges on Peleliu. That earplug has broken off this side. But as a kid, I would always want to take this down and I'd want to put it on and play with it. And he, of course, discouraged that. But he didn't mind me looking at it. He just didn't want me taking it and playing with it, running around in the yard, that kind of thing. This is the first edition of With the Old Breed that my dad signed to me on my 17th birthday.
In With the Old Breed, he wrote with brutal honesty about what those souvenirs really meant. He recalled, "The Japanese's personal belongings, such as their packs, swords, and field gear, were of great interest to us. Souvenir hunting was a favorite pastime." Yet Sledge didn't romanticize it. The further the war dragged on, the more disturbing these habits became. In one passage, he admitted, "We had become hardened. Souvenirs were reminders of the horror and ferocity we lived through." His words remind us that behind every object carried home was a story of violence, endurance, and the cost of war.
This is a Japanese flag. Japanese soldiers frequently would take Japanese flags, fold them up, put them in the headbands of inside their helmets, or they would carry them in their packs. This particular flag my dad took out of a Japanese soldier's pack on Okinawa. This is his dungaree jacket.
Sledge wore the standard Marine combat uniform.
On the breast pocket here, USMC, the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor. You can see EBS, his initials right there.
Sledge remembered, "Our clothes were stiff with sweat, stained with mud, and reeked of mildew." His uniform wasn't just clothing. It was a symbol of endurance, soaked with the memory of each battle.
And then this is my father's dog tag. And this is actually worn by Eugene Sledge.
Sledge recalled that Japanese officers' swords were prized symbols of victory.
This is a samurai saber. It is not an officer's. It has duct tape on the hilt. The handle was broken, so I just did that to try to keep it together. But this sat in the corner of my dad's study, just like this. And you'll see tomorrow the exact spot where I'm talking about. But he actually picked this up when K-35 went through the ruins of what had been Shuri Castle. When Shuri had been attacked and overrun and bombarded into rubble, the Japanese, of course, had already bugged out and moved on farther south. But I remember seeing this in his study and asking him, where did you get this? What's the story behind this saber? And my dad, just kind of being the matter of fact, straight ahead kind of guy, he said, I just picked it up in the ruins of, amid the rubble of Shuri Castle when K Company went through there as they pushed south. There's no dramatic story to it. It's not like he fought the guy and took it. There's nothing like that. It was just lying there in the rubble. But a lot of people, when I've shown my dad's artifacts, they go crazy over this thing. And I don't know. My dad always said, look, it doesn't have a jewel in the hilt. It's an NCO's sword, not an officer's sword. So there's really no particular value to it. It has a lot of value to me personally, just because of the fact that my dad picked it up and brought it home.
This simple Marine Corps cap, worn by Eugene Sledge in the Pacific, carries the weight of battles fought in some of the harshest conditions of World War II. As Sledge wrote in his book, we existed in an environment totally incomprehensible to men behind the lines. The cap on my head was part of the armor that carried me through it.
I remember when I was a kid, like 3 or 4 years old, playing out in the yard, and when my dad would just be out in the yard raking leaves or doing yard work, he would sometimes wear that. And then, obviously as the years went by, he quit doing that and just put it aside to be preserved. But yeah, just a really beautiful example of that kind of headgear. And obviously it means a lot to me because it's my dad's. You can see that herringbone twill pattern in the fabric. This is a snapshot of my dad's mortar squad. This is at the end of Okinawa, and it's actually what I chose to be the cover for my book. I always liked this picture of my dad. He's got his helmet cocked over to one side. I just thought that was a great picture of him, and I remember asking him, why did you not have that in with the old breed? Because it's a great picture of you. And he said, I just, the book was about my buddies. It wasn't about me. So, but I've always liked that picture. When I was a kid and I would go visit him at his office, he had this picture on the end of his filing cabinet, sitting in a frame. But I just always thought that was such a great shot, and it's why I chose it to be the cover of my book.
The K-bar knife was Eugene Sledge's constant companion in the Pacific.
This was my dad's K-bar and its sheath. My father-in-law mounted it to this plaque. When I was a kid in his study, this K-bar was just lying there with the case on his bookcase. And when I would go in there and we would talk about things and have conversations, I would always pick it up and just look at it, and he would always say, see how well balanced it is. I mean, you'll never see a knife as beautifully balanced as a K-bar. And
Sledge wrote, each man carried a K-bar, the Marine's indispensable weapon and utility knife. We lived at close quarters with cold steel, and a knife was as vital to a Marine as his rifle.
This is a Japanese bayonet. You see a scene in Part 7 of the Pacific where Joe Mazzello, portraying Sledge, is looking at a Japanese bayonet, and he ends up just throwing it down in disgust. This is an actual Japanese bayonet that my dad picked up from one of the Japanese soldiers they killed in that bunker on Ingasivas. And again, my father-in-law mounted this for me many years ago. Just remember my dad telling me this little piece of wood. I don't know exactly what that is, but he said it had some religious significance. But it's just a beautiful example of that kind of weapon. And I'm just really thrilled that I've got it mounted like that, and the K-bar.
Eugene was not the only member of his family to serve in World War II.
Eugene Sledge and my uncle, Edward. You can see my Uncle Edward was an armored tank platoon commander, started the war as a lieutenant. He was a graduate of the Citadel. He was in the 741st Tank Battalion, finished the war, was promoted to major, the rank of major, at the end of the war. And then my father in his dress blues, wearing the fourragere of the 5th Marines. I believe this picture was not long after they both got home to Mobile. Just a fantastic picture of both of them.
Their parallel journeys, separated by oceans, show how the war touched nearly every American family in many profound and personal ways.
That brings us to, so this is the combat pack worn and carried by Eugene Sledge. You see his name stenciled on the bottom. But he had this, you know, it was on the top shelf of his closet when I was a kid. I would take it down and look at it. I was really fascinated by it. Here you see K Company, you see his name, Sledge, EB. But I mean, this pack was what he was wearing D-Day at Peleliu and D-Day at Okinawa. And I was just always captivated by that, you know, the fact that, I mean, he carried this through the entire deal, and this was worn in combat by Eugene Sledge. I've told the story many times as a kid. I asked him, you know, because I would take it down and look at all this stuff. And, you know, I asked him if I could carry my books to school in it because I thought my friends would think it was pretty cool. And, you know, he very indulgently said, no, I don't think so.
The HBO miniseries The Pacific created the myth that Eugene Sledge carried a .38 caliber revolver in World War II. But in reality, he was issued and carried a standard M1911 pistol. This is
his .45 that he carried. My grandfather actually got it, sent it to my dad when he was on Peleliu. So he carried that through Okinawa. Many times, you know, I would look at this under his supervision. Of course, I was just fascinated by it, knowing he had carried it in combat. You know, he took me out to shoot it when I was 16. He wouldn't let me shoot it before then because, you know, obviously he said a pistol is like a snake; it can turn around and bite you. But that was carried by Eugene Sledge through Okinawa.
I never had to fire my .45 caliber pistol in combat, but I kept it close at hand at all times, Sledge recalled in his book.
So this is a sake cup, again picked up around the same vicinity as where he got the samurai, so the ruins in the rubble of Shuri Castle.
That ancient stronghold became, in his words, the bloody, stinking debris of smashed humanity, a symbol of the battle's savage cost.
Japanese harakiri knife taken off a dead Japanese soldier from the bunker on Ingasibus. It's very sharp. Well, fairly sharp. These collar insignia.
Sledge famously cut the collar insignia from a dead Japanese soldier as a souvenir.
So, frequently, he cut these off the collars of dead Japanese soldiers.
He later reflected, "We had become hardened, but we were not immune to the insanity around us. These small pieces of cloth are a haunting reminder of what war drove men to do." Sledge also wrote, "It was not out of hate, but out of a strange compulsion born of battle." As Henry Sledge lays out the relics of his father's service, they become more than objects. They are silent witnesses to the brutality and sacrifice of the Pacific War. Eugene Sledge carried the weight of these memories for the rest of his life, later writing, "The war was far more than a series of individual adventures. It was, in truth, the most profound experience of our lives." These souvenirs remind us not only of one man's journey, but of the cost paid by an entire generation.